Greetings yet again to each and all, those who still care and dare to listen, and a wicked welcome to Mythophrenia, where you find talks and texts by Gnostic teacher John Lash on a range of topics relevant to the Terma of Gaia awakening, the Sophianic view of life, planetary Tantra, and the Calico War Party. Recording on January 28th, 2017, and this is a talk to accompany the second text in the three-part series, The True Lucifer is Sophia. So you may recall that the title of that second text is The Satanic Distortion. And I'm more or less inclined to title this talk, which is designed to accompany the text and expand upon it and extrapolate from it to a certain degree. I'm inclined to call the talk The Satanic Hero. I think it would be certainly incomplete and inadequate to round off the material on the Sophia-Lucifer implex without taking a look at the topic of the satanic hero, because that is part of the distortion of the satanic figure. What you could say is that the satanic figure becomes distorted from its original introduction in Judaism, where Satan or Shaitan is simply the advocate or lawyer for the Creator God. From that introduction, the figure of Satan, and it was never a capitalized name, it was never a particular demonic entity. Shaitan or Satan was a role, the role of the devil's advocate, who is in fact the devil itself. And from that moment on, that figure began to become very distorted and contorted and inverted, as occurs in the instance of an implex. And so, when you come into the period of Christianity, the satanic role, the satanic figure undergoes a further extortion in the figure of Pan. Now, Pan is the goat god of the pagan peoples, who represents the consort of the mother god, who is Sophia herself. So Pan and Sophia come together. Wherever you find one, you're always going to find the other. Due to their biophobia and their self-hatred, which D.H. Lawrence pointed out, the early Christians and Christians today have to demonize Pan, who represents the good, natural, sensual, and sexual instincts of the human animal. They have to demonize and distort Pan into Satan. So you can see that the figure of Satan through the ages was subject to a vast amount of distortion until you come to the 18th century and John Milton. And in Milton's poem, Paradise Lost, there is a correction of the figure of Satan. You might use the analogy of the distorting mirrors in a funny house at a carnival. The Hall of Mirrors is a place where you go. It's a labyrinth of mirrors, and the mirrors are distorted. And so you see your own reflection distorted in comical and grotesque ways. So the figure of Satan passes through a labyrinth of distorting mirrors until finally, at the end of the 17th century, with the English poet John Milton, somehow, through the psyche and artistic genius of John Milton, the satanic distortion begins to correct itself. And out of that correction comes the figure of the satanic hero. Have you ever heard this term, satanic hero? Generally, if you go into English literature and the study of the Romantic poets, Byron, Keats, and Shelley, Coleridge, William Blake, of course, you'll find that those poets referred back to John Milton, and they referred to the figure of Satan, Lucifer, in Milton, because the two figures are confounded in Milton. They referred to that figure for a persona of the rebel. The romantic rebel is in fact largely drawn from the tradition of Milton's representation of Satan, Lucifer. And this is something you would know if you took courses in English literature or comparative literature of Europe. And so the satanic hero, quotes, is often referred to as the Byronic hero. The reason being simply that the British Romantic poet Lord Byron treated the figure of the hero in a way that gave it a satanic flair and a satanic glamour. And it was particularly Byron's portrait of the hero in his poetry and also in the manner in which he lived, which influenced the generation of the Romantics and generations to come thereafter. So I would assume that perhaps a good many of you who are listening to my words right now, my recorded words, would not be familiar with this notion of the satanic hero. It's a tremendous theme in the history of European culture and literature. It is a tremendous motif. So perhaps to kick off this spoken commentary on the satanic distortion, it would be appropriate to give you a little bit of a taste of the satanic hero, a portrait or profile coming from Lord Byron in his long poem entitled Lara. It's also worth noting, by the way, that Byron once commented to Lady Byron that he had personified in Lara, the poetic character of Lara, more of himself than he had put in any of his other characters. So the satanic hero in this case stands as a self-portrait for the Romantic poet who invented him. In him, inexplicably mixed, appeared much to be loved and hated, sought and feared. Opinion varying o'er his hidden lot, in praise or railing, ne'er his name forgot. His silence formed a theme for others' prate. They guessed, they gazed, they fain would know his fate. What had he been? What was he, thus unknown, who walked their world, his lineage only known? A hater of his kind? Yet some would say, with them he could seem gay amidst the gay. End quote. That's the opening passage from section 17 of the long poem, Lara. You see that there's a mixture of qualities in the profile of the hero. He's loved, he's hated, he's feared, sought after, slandered, basically remains unknown. They guessed, they gazed, they fain would know his fate. So the romantic hero has a certain alluring quality, but also a certain alienating quality to ordinary people. And also, I'd have you note that in the last line, the last two lines, a hater of his kind, yet some would say with them he could seem gay amidst the gay. End quote. You see that in that line, Lord Byron uses the term gay as it would have been used among romantics before it was co-opted into a term that specifically referred to the so-called homosexual lifestyle, which, by the way, is a huge con. The homosexual lifestyle is a con. Homosexuals may exist. This has been known to happen through the ages. But the attachment of the word gay as a label to promote the homosexual lifestyle is an unfortunate co-optation of that word. Somewhere in the Navigator briefings, I mentioned the work by Nietzsche called The Gay Science, and I showed that the word gay, as it was originally used, and also later used even up to the time of William Butler Yeats, represented a wisdom and a knowledge of the human condition. It represented the happiness, the wit, and the serene humor that dwells upon a transcendent view of life and a transcendent view of humanity at large and of one's own self, of one's own stock and stake in humanity. Those who take an ironic, detached, and transcendent view of those matters are gay. And so that is what the notion meant to Byron, and it also meant to him outrageous, romping, and hedonistic exploits of all kinds, because Byron was an unapologetic voluptuary. Another passage. There was in him a vital scorn of all, as if the worst had fallen which could befall. He stood a stranger in this breathing world, an erring spirit from another hurled, a thing of dark imaginings that shaped by choice the perils he by chance escaped. But scaped in vain, for in their memory yet his mind would half exult and half regret. With more capacity for love than earth bestows on most of mortal mold and birth, his early dreams of good outstripped the truth, and troubled manhood followed baffled youth. Unquote. Note here that Byron explicitly confers upon the Satanic or Byronic hero the capacity to love more or in excess than what is bestowed upon most of the mortal mold and birth. So in the romantic conception of that time, and consistently in the heroic figures that were propagated from the Romantic movement, the true and pure figure of the hero was not in any way a sadist or someone who wished harm to others, but rather a noble person who was capable of love in greater measure than the ordinary person, and who was often maligned for that fact. It's only later, at the end of the 19th century, and I'll come back to this point if I can remember later in the commentary, at the end of the 19th century, when you reach the period which is called la décadence, the decadence, which was kind of like the seeding of the Romantic movement, when you plant a garden and it flourishes, and then the garden starts to go to seed. And when the Romantic movement went to seed, it gave rise to a number of other movements which were very fertile. The symbolist movement in literature and poetry at the end of the 19th century. Not symbolic, the symbolist movement. And even modernism itself can be regarded as the late progeny of Romanticism. But during the period of its seediness, which was at the end of the 19th century and in the first decade and a half prior to World War I, you find that Romanticism became contaminated with what I call salon Satanism. The figure of the hero in the novel, for instance, Against the Grain by the Belgian writer Huysman, is contaminated by salon Satanism. That is to say, a kind of sensational decadence, like you find today very much in certain circles of the rich and the ultra-rich. This love of cheap and empty sensationalism, this posturing in the guise of heresy, of witchcraft, of taking on the guise and the trappings of something satanic. It's actually just a game of posturing and posing. And the satanic hero fell into that morass of pretensions. Some century or so after Lord Byron was writing. But when Byron was depicting the hero, he was depicting the pure form of the hero. That is to say, a character of exceptional morality and integrity who stands in rebellion against the dual demons of authority and conventionality who rule the ordinary human world. Byron, for one, really lived up to the model of the hero that he celebrated in his poetry. He was, of course, an English aristocrat who inherited a fortune, and he could live exactly as he liked, and he lived lavishly. In fact, he had one of the stories about him is that he rented this massive villa in this palace, really, in Venice on the canal. And in this palace he lived with an endless procession of Italian hookers coming and going, and animals, including a lion and zebras, I believe, in the palace. Byron was a man who lived up to his word. He was the satanic rebel who stood against authority, including religious authority and the authority of the state, both. And he also stood against convention and conventionality and conformity. So he was, in life and art, an outstanding example of the satanic rebel. So one final little passage from section 19 of Lara. With all that chilling mystery of mien, and seeming gladness to remain unseen, he had, if 'twere not nature's boon, an art of fixing memory on another's heart. It was not love, perchance, nor hate, nor aught that words can image to express the thought. But they who saw him did not see in vain, and once beheld would ask of him again. And those to whom he spake remembered well, and on the words, however light, would dwell. None knew, nor how, nor why, but he entwined himself perforce upon the hearer's mind. So on that note, I invite you to return with me to the written text for part 2 of The True Lucifer is Sophia. And I would like now to just make a brief review and a quick look over of that material before I conclude with some more remarks that extrapolate upon this theme. First and foremost, I ask you to register in your mind that if you are to undertake the superlearning event offered by the divine intervention of Sophia, right here, right now, in the time that you are alive, in the time that I am alive to say these words, and you are alive to hear these words, then you must clear your mind. You must clear your mental disk and delete all of the corrupt files that you have carried regarding these two figures of Lucifer on the one hand and Satan on the other. Now bear in mind that when we look back, as in we do the detective work and you go back into ancient texts, go back into comparative mythology, the first thing that has to be established is the difference in these two figures. Unfortunately, by the time that Milton writes Paradise Lost, it is impossible to tell if he's writing about Lucifer or Satan. And today, people carry on that error. The file is corrupt. They don't know whether they are talking about Lucifer or Satan or both. And at the end of the day, they simply don't know what they're talking about. So you have the responsibility to clear your mental disk to clear your mind of these corrupted files. Whenever you look in the direction of this material, take care to remind yourself to be precise and sober and steady in the way you behold these figures in your imagination. They are just figures in your imagination. They are creations of human imagination. That is the way to encounter them, to understand them. And they are distinct. The Luciferic figure, as I've noted, does not have a really genuine mythological provenance. So, if you look into Canaanite mythology, which is where most scholars would take you for the origins of the Lucifer figure, well, what do you find? Not much at all. You find really a reference to a figure who is named as Atar, and that is a Canaanite god or hero figure who wished to possess the throne of Baal, and being unable to do so, was thrown down or thrown back or defeated and descended into the underworld. This very slim, very poorly supported Canaanite motif is the only genuine mythological provenance for Lucifer. And in my view, it's not strong enough to make a real case, but it is there and scholars will mention it. So it appears that the famous passage in Isaiah 14 draws upon the Canaanite myth. Well, that's not surprising, since everything that is in the Judaic scriptures is taken from somewhere else. Almost everything is taken from somewhere else. There is very little originality in Judaism, except for the really evil and dangerous parts of it, which are original to the Jewish mind. But otherwise, the material, the mythological material, and the religious references and inferences, say, in the Old Testament, are drawn from the background of the Canaanite and pagan cultures where the earliest Hebrews lived. So the famous passage in Isaiah 14 repeats the theme of the Canaanite myth of Atar, where it speaks of, I will make myself like the Most High, but then the figure who declares that intention is brought down into the realm of the dead, or into the realm of the underworld. There's your origin of the Luciferic figure. The Luciferic figure always contains this notion of having been on high and having been thrown down into the infernal regions. However, when you go back and you look for the taproot of the Satanic motif and the Satan entity in mythology, you do not find that notion. The taproot of the Satanic character, the Satanic culprit in the plot, is in the book of Job. It's again a feature you find in Judaic religion. And this indeed may, in some respects, be a unique feature. It could be said that the Shaitan, who is the lawyer for Jehovah, making a case against Job in the Old Testament, is a unique creation of Jewish psychology or meta-psychology. That's possible. You could say, okay, to boil it down to the punchline, the Jews invented lawyers, okay? The role of a lawyer as a devil's advocate is very Jewish. So there are two culprits involved in the studies of the Lucifer Sophia implex on the one hand and the Great Deception on the other hand. Always bear in mind and hold in mind the distinction between these two figures. Remember that an implex is different from a complex. An implex is kind of like an unstable complex. If you mix certain chemicals together, like if you mix together hydrogen and oxygen in a stable form, you get water, H2O. But there are certain chemical mixes which are very unstable. And this Lucifer-Satan mix is an implex in itself. We have the Sophia-Lucifer implex, but you could also say there is the Lucifer-Satan implex. You see the point I'm making? And it's extremely volatile, extremely unstable implex charged with different mythological themes and connotations and value judgments. For instance, in its original role, Lucifer stands forth as an adversary competing with God. I want to be equal to the Most High, or I will not accept the superiority of the human animal, Adam Anthropos, that God has created. I am above Adam Anthropos. So in the original Luciferic figure, you see an adversarial position of competition with God. Whereas in the original figure of Shaitan or Satan, Satan in the book of Job is not in competition with God. On the contrary, Satan is the advocate of Jehovah in the book of Job. So you see, these are nuances that you get to when you dig down to the bottom of the barrel, and it's a very long and hard dig getting down there. But these are things that you need to know to clear your mind for the installation. And everything else you can dismiss. The Satanic Distortion, part 2 of my study of the Lucifer Sophia implex, begins and opens with the notorious image of Baphomet. I would like to think that I'm doing you all a big favor as a teacher. Teachers like to do big favors for their students and make life easier for you. You don't have to haul your sorry ass through everything that I've had to go through to get to say what I can say to you right now. This figure of Baphomet is nothing but salon Satanism kitsch that's coming from a defrocked Catholic priest, Eliphas Levi. There was no, in antiquity, there is no figure of Baphomet. It's a joke. It's a bad cartoon. And those today who parade this figure on the internet, the Christians particularly, who hold up this figure of Baphomet as an image of the devil, in their sincere intention, let's give them that, in their sincere intention to inform you of how the great deception is working, they prove themselves to be entirely caught in it. And one of the proofs is holding up the poster boy, girl, androgyne goat bat of Baphomet, and claiming that this is an image of cosmic evil and satanic power working in the world. It is nothing of the sort. Baphomet, as represented here, has no more legitimacy as a genuine mythic image than Donald Duck. Okay, moving on. Now, as we scan the written material, you see that I devoted quite a few pages to this topic of the Nephilim, so-called egregores, the watchers, the watchful angels, the fallen angel motif. The fallen angel file is another one of those corrupt files that you need to delete from your mental disk. The hard disk of your imagination needs to be clean in order to receive the installation coming with the superlearning event. And as long as you still entertain delusional and unfounded notions about the, quote, fallen angels, unquote, you will not, I swear to you, you will not be able to take advantage of the superlearning event. The fallen angels, the Anunnaki, the giants of the book of Enoch, and so forth and so on, are the subject of hundreds of hours of discussion and speculation in the alternative media, as well as in books. Probably I could, you could easily make a list of 20 books that are expounding to you about the Anunnaki, the fallen angels, the watchers of the book of Enoch, and they're conflating all of these figures. Usually that is how you find the material handled, in a conflation, in a jumble, in a huge mishmash of all of these figures. All of that is erroneous. All of that is a complete waste of your time. As I explain in the textual material here, there is a huge factor of omission operating in those many attempts that have been made to penetrate this material and to elucidate it correctly. You cannot elucidate the material of the fallen angels and the watchers of the book of Enoch correctly if you omit the theme of the gender rift. The theme of the gender rift is a subplot factor in the Sophianic narrative. And it goes like this. At a certain moment, before the earth was formed, and before humanity therefore could emerge on the earth, although strains of humanity had already appeared on other planets in other solar systems. But before the earth that you inhabit appeared, and before the Anthropos emerged on the earth, an event happened in the cosmos due to Sophia's plunge from the galactic core. At a certain moment, when the Aeon Sophia, when her torrential body of aeonic plasmic light, the living luminosity of the Aeon, was pooling into a whirlpool formation, a fetal formation, if you will. It was curling itself into a fetal formation out of which the material body of the earth would be born. The material body of the planet was born out of the fetal whirl of the plasmic light of the Aeon Sophia. The fetal vortex, you could say. And as this fetal vortex was forming, and the torrent of living aeonic plasma of her body was taking on the material elements of the Dema, of the galactic arms outside the core, it developed tremendous centripetal force. There is no centripetal or centrifugal force in the core of the galaxy. The core of the galaxy is a float. It's only a float mechanism. It floats, just like the organic light floats. But in the galactic arms, there is centripetal force and centrifugal force. And the centripetal force of the fetal vortex of Sophia was so great that it tore away part of the genomic template embedded in the Orion Nebula. And so part of the template was incorporated into what was to become the material body of the earth. That is the gender rift. What is the result of that great cosmic event, which has been alluded to in many mythologies, by the way? The separation of the sexes is a theme, it's a mythological theme. Books have been written about it. You can find that different mythologies from both high cultures and from indigenous cultures refer to this, although none of them will give you the version I'm giving you right now. What is the result of the rifting of the anthropic template? Well, part of the human genome was incorporated into the materiality of the planet. And so when the materiality of the planet itself matured into the body of the planet, women appeared as the first inhabitants of the earth. They emerged out of the body of the planet. So you have the entire sub-theme of the Sophianic narrative centered on the figure of the arboreal nymphs, or the Gaian she, Sidhe. It's a Gallic word from Celtic mythology. And you'll see that I have included here a link to Tree Nymphs and Tree Hung Shamans, Part 2, the Chthonian Romance. The Chthonian Romance refers to that long, long period of countless aeons, of hundreds of thousands of years of time, in the prehistory of the prehistory of the prehistory of humanity, when the Gaian women, the primordial inhabitants of the planet, encountered their male counterparts. Well, if the Gaian women arose coevally with the material processes of nature, which is a mythological proposition that I guarantee you can be proven and will eventually be proven in solid scientific terms through the correct evolutionary sciences. If the first inhabitants of the planet were women who grew out of the body of the planet, then where did the men come from? Well, the men came from outer space. The men descended from the Orion Nebula. The men are the watchers. The men are those who descend from heaven. They are not the Anunnaki, considered as archontic intruders. So don't confuse these two themes. The Orion men, as I call them, have been described in various snippets of folklore, all the way from Tibet to Egypt. And I, in fact, quote some Tibetan lore, which says that, and this is derived from Bonpo shamanism, which says that opening the door of the sky, which is a term in shamanism, in shamanic language of Tibet, designates ascent into the celestial sphere by means of a magical rainbow light cord. Now that's Tibet. Now if you go to Polynesia, go to Hawaii, go to Polynesia, and investigate the Kahuna shamanic tradition, and you will find that one of the main teachings of Kahuna is about the Aka thread. This theme of the Aka thread is universal in world mythology. And when you investigate it in depth and in close detail, as I have done over many decades of my life, you can form a coherent scenario of the events that happened leading to the encounter between the men who descended from the Orion Nebula and their female counterparts on Earth, who arose coevally with the material body of the Earth. Now this entire story, if you omit it, if you overlook it, if you exclude it, well, makes it impossible to work out who the Nephilim and the Watchers and the fallen angels really were, who they really were. So this is a tremendously difficult and challenging area of what I call the folk history of the human species, the phylogenetic record. And it's largely through access to phylogenetic memory which is a capacity of genuine shamanism, that the elements of this scenario can be recovered. And I've done this, and I've done it to an enormous degree. You could write 3 books. You could make 3 books out of what I've done in the retrieval of this narrative by accessing the memory circuits of the transpersonal memory bank of the anthropos. So when I wrote about this in the second part of the Lucifer Sophia investigation, I got it off my chest, and I explain what the problem is. But I also say, unfortunately, that within the confines of one particular essay, there is no way to elucidate this factor of the fallen goddess scenario. In fact, it would take another course. It would take more than a 6-week course of 3 2-hour classes each week in order to elucidate this material properly. So there you go. You get the distillation, and if you want to go and investigate it yourself, feel free to do so. But I can tell you that I can advise you that it would be more to your advantage to simply delete any corrupt files you have on this material and go on fresh from here. You don't have time to go back into this, believe me. You don't have time, believe me, to read the Book of Enoch or the 3 or 4 different versions of it in Ethiopian and other ancient languages and work out who's who and what's what. There's no time for that. The super learning event is happening in a flash, and it is a fast lane learning event. So I hope by presenting these 2 pairs of essays, the 3 diamonds on the left and the 3 diamonds on the right, in the card of the 10 of diamonds, I hope by presenting this material to you that I give you the basis for proceeding forward. Don't look back. There's no time to look back. No more time. Continuing now, in a quick review of the remaining text, there's a subheading, Fallen Angel Magic. And there I make the distinction between the fallen angels considered as non-human or superhuman Luciferian entities and the fallen angels or watchers considered as the Orion men, the primordial men who came to earth on the Akka threads, and kingship descended from heaven. They came to earth on the Akka threads, and theocracy and male power descended from heaven on Akka threads. That's a famous line, the famous opening line from the Enuma Elish, which is a creation epic from the Akkadian culture, I believe. And kingship descended from heaven. If you, that's a meme. That's not a meme. Hashtag kingship descends from heaven, right? If you get that single meme, you can retain that, extract that from the corrupt files, retain it in your hard disk, but retain it in the frame of elucidation that I'm offering here you in this text, okay? I'm offering you here in this text. So I say Christians, along with many others, will of course continue to insist that the Watchers were Luciferian fallen angels or even archons. Well, I cannot prove that this is not so except by elaborate exposition, and I ask no one to take my word on it. I can only advise the reader to consider a narrative that may come across as entirely novel, unprecedented by anything you have previously learned or heard. And that is the story of the gender rift. So it was the Orion men, or as they are called in the narrative, the hunters from Orion, who taught women the cosmetic secrets and the secrets of disguise. Why is that? Well, obviously, because as hunters, they wore makeup to disguise themselves as plants to hide in the underbrush, or as animals to be equated or confused with the animals they were seeking. And they taught these arts of disguise and cosmetic makeup to the women as described in the book of Enoch, and I think even in the Old Testament. It was not the Watchers, it was not Luciferian fallen angels who did that, it was men who did that. Just like men today are the leading couturiers in the fashion world, and the great fashion empires, the great cosmetic empires you'll find, like Estee Lauder and Max Factor, well, have been more or less equally founded and directed by men and women. There follows a short passage in which I explain that the name Baphomet encodes the name Sophia. And I think I've said enough about that. Requires no further elaboration. So we come down to the last two brief sections of the material, subheading Devil Worship, and following that, Erotic Bliss. So, in Devil Worship, I merely try to point out that there are a number of terms which are thrown around carelessly. And if you're going to use them at all, you would do well to reduce them to a simple and elementary and unambiguous meaning, so that you don't use them incorrectly. So Lucifer and the devil refers to any radiant entity. Divine is from the same root as devil. It means radiant, supernatural. Remember, the natural world is an emanation of the supernatural. The supernatural is the fountainhead of the natural world. Therefore, you can say that everything in the natural world radiates out of the supernatural world. But due to the manner in which that occurs, the supernatural conceals itself within its own radiant emanation. The explanation of this process and the detailed and excruciatingly elaborate description of this process can be found in the Hindu Tantric teachings. There you find, in Woodruff, for instance, there you find the description of the self-veiling action of the primordial ground consciousness. The consciousness at the source of the universe veils itself in giving rise to the appearance of the universe. And so the devil refers to that radiant supernatural matrix from which everything comes. Diabolos simply means adversary or opponent. Satan means the same thing, adversary, opponent. It's a role, not an entity. Demon, according to Christians, blah, blah, blah. But according to the Greek word, which may be spelled either A-E or A-I, the daemon, the demonic, does not refer to an infernal, harmful, malevolent power. The daemon, or demonic spirit, of the pagan classic world was a guiding spirit, a spirit guide, to use the New Age term. One who inspires and advises, as, for instance, the daemon of Socrates. And these entities may be compared to the tutelary deities in Tibetan Buddhism, that is to say, to dakinis. So dakinis are the daemonic spirits of planetary tantra. Get your syntax clear and simple, and keep it that way. to prepare yourself for the superlearning event. Now I take a moment to delve into the meaning of this word worship. I have to say here, personally, if I might interject my personal view for a moment, I really detest the word worship. I find I'm someone who thinks of myself as a person who really can't be offended by anything. And that's basically true, but I can be close to offended by the word worship because it is such bullshit. It is such a bullshit term. It is such a con term. It means nothing whatsoever. You hear people say, "Oh, the Christians today go to church on Sunday to worship their God." What do they worship? What is worship? Have you ever seen anyone worship? Are Muslims worshiping Allah when they get down on their hands and knees and press their forehead to the ground? Is that worship? No, that's submission. That's vile and disgusting self-degradation. If that's what worship is, then fine. I think that worship should be called self-degradation, because that is what most of the worship conducted in the world today is. Even the Kali worshippers, who I've seen in India, they are a disgusting, obsequious bunch of filthy, clambering fools who are spreading chicken feathers and blood over the statue of Kali in some wretched shrine in some corner of some field. That's worship. I advise you, have nothing to do with worship. No. As I wrote here, those who already feel their own worth do not need to worship anything. I would say that those individuals who have true self-worth abhor the notion of any kind of religious worship. I certainly do. I do not worship the Aeon Sophia. I do not worship the Dakinis. I do not worship the earth. I adore the earth. I revere and respect the earth. But I do not worship the earth in the sense of some disgusting and degrading religious ritual where I place myself in abject devotion before the earth. No way. No way. I am sure that people commenting on planetary tantra and the Sophianic way of life will say, "Oh yeah, Lash encourages his devotees and his disciples and students to worship the goddess Sophia." But I have never done that, and I shall never do that. Such an act of reverence as one feels toward the earth has to be expressed, articulated, spoken, and stated in an open manner every day in every possible situation. Not to persuade or convert anyone, but to demonstrate the very great fact that the adoration you direct toward the local cosmic source of life vitally upholds your life. And it does something else as well. By that adoring reverence, each human animal comes into the strength to accept a singular and supreme opportunity, namely, to enact the role of the lesser beast, the lamb from the earth. More specifically, this is the opportunity to handle the power of the great beast, the animal mother, to handle it. So when I revere the earth and give my adoration as an animal to the mother animal, she gives me in turn the strength it takes to handle her power. This is the deal. This is the pact. This is the heart and core of planetary tantra. This is the most powerful moral magic system of dynamic cooperation conceivable to the human mind. The formula, the dynamic formula, you could say, of planetary Tantra is simple. The more deeply and truly you adore the earth, the more strength you receive from the earth to handle her power. She needs the human animal to handle her power. Tomegatherion, the great beast of the book of Revelation, is nothing other than the planetary animal mother. And the lesser beast is the handler of the great beast. Now you'll see that I conclude the written text with some comments under the heading of erotic bliss. And there I use a quotation from Wilhelm Reich's book, The Function of the Orgasm. This is also the quotation that you find on the landing page of metahistory.org. Knowledge of that which is alive can alone banish terror. Off and on, over the last few years, since the Gaian navigation experiment, I've had occasion to use these two terms, biophobia and biophilia. Biophobia means a fear of life, an aversion to that which is alive. And biophilia means, by contrast, a love of all that which is alive. If there is a battle taking place on earth, it is not correctly described in the Christian notion of the great deception. Cosmic good versus cosmic evil. God versus Satan. No. It is more correctly described by the opposition between biophilia and biophobia. There are people who are biophobic, and it is a pathological condition. It is a desperate and debilitating insanity. Some human creatures, some human animals suffer from biophobia. There is one particular ethnic group of human animals who show by their history and by the ideology of their ethnic identity, the ideology attached to their ethnic identity, that they are extremely biophobic. Well, who would that be, do you think? Gee whiz, let me think. Well, I seem to remember that I started reading Fraser, The Golden Bough, when I was 17. So I read all of The Golden Bough. You think you have time to go do that? Go ahead, I wish you luck. And in The Golden Bough, I was introduced to the idea of totems. So then I went on in my 20s to investigate totemism, which is a subcategory of animism. And what did I learn? Well, very simply, that certain tribes, for instance, Indian tribes of the northeast of what is now the United States of America, would have an animal totem, say for instance the salmon or the bear. And consistent with totemic customs all around the world, the people who held the bear or the beaver as their totem animal would not consume the totem animal. They would not eat their totemic animal, except at times of special feasts. So when you study totemism and the structure, the anthropological structure of the totemic cults all around the world, you find that they are absolutely uniform in this respect. There is no evidence in these cults of a biophobic taboo. Those natives who hold the salmon as their totem animal and do not eat the salmon except on special festive occasions, do not refrain from eating the salmon because they are biophobic. So, by the study of totemism, you arrive at a certain norm. This is a study that falls into the rather daunting category of what is called, here goes, structural anthropology, which was founded by a French Jewish anthropologist named Levi Strauss, not to be confused with Levi Brühl. So, in structural anthropology and in other areas of comparative anthropology and comparative mythology, you encounter the model or paradigm of totemic beliefs. And yet they do not exhibit biophobia. But by the very fact that you can recognize a totemic structure, by the very fact that you are educated enough in the material to see the norm of totemic religion in an indigenous culture, such as the Kanak of Melanesia or the Pima Indians of the California coast, by the very fact of being able to recognize what is the norm, you can detect something that is abnormal, anomalous, and potentially deviant. Biophobia is deviant in the human animal. And if you ask yourself, is there any particular culture around the world that exhibits biophobia, even perhaps to a very high degree? Well, did the Aztecs exhibit biophobia? The hundreds of tribes of Native Americans, the Siberians, the ancient Chinese? Do you find biophobia in the ancient Chinese? Have you looked? How about biophobia in, the Persians or the Greeks or various African tribes, which are all heavily totemic? Nope. You don't find it except in one place. Go look in the Old Testament. Go look at the 642 rules that Jews are supposed to follow in order to be strictly and perfectly obedient to their off-planet Father God. And in these rules, are they from Leviticus or Deuteronomy? I don't know where they're listed. In these rules, which are the rules of super-Orthodox Judaism, you find a great number of them which are biophobic or which exhibit pathological biophobia. And why would the ancient Hebrews and the Jews, in their definition of their culture, if you can call it that, in their religious culture, and in the precepts and rules of Judaism, why would you find evidence of extremely pernicious biophobia? Well, that is a clue to the presence of an alien anti-vital element. And what is the alien anti-vital factor? The anti-natural factor. It is the archontic factor. So that little exposition brings the mind around, once again, forcibly, to the Gnostic warning, namely, that the Jews are proxies to the archons, and that it is the archons who made them Jews in the first place. And it is also the archons and the archontic infection that makes them biophobic. So what is the cure for biophobia? Well, according to Wilhelm Reich, it was a good and honest fuck. That's a very simple cure. It's also the same cure that you find indicated in the Gospel of Philip. which is one of the longest and most well-preserved texts in the Coptic materials, you will find a long commentary by yours truly on the Gospel of Philip on metahistory.org. The cure to biophobia and the power that you need to have up and running in order to defeat the biophobic ghouls running around on this planet is erotic power. It's what Wilhelm Reich called orgastic potency. So go read The Function of the Orgasm and find out what it's all about. So I conclude the written material with this paragraph. Be certain on this point. The power of that psychotic fiction, which is inspired by biophobia, operates nefariously in the human mind in ways that can only be overcome and reversed by a superior power, by true counter-magic. Biophilia overcoming biophobia, pleasure and delight overcoming pain and suffering, self-love overcoming guilt and shame. And I conclude with a quotation, one of my favorites, as you may know, from the Maha-Nirvana Tantra. The rites of the devotees of the Ajja Kali are a pleasure to perform. I feel compelled to add a brief comment regarding biophilia. It's never my intention to play upon anyone's sexual insecurities. I realize that sexual insecurity is a pervasive or pandemic syndrome of our time, which afflicts everyone, I repeat. So, to modulate a bit the strength of my remark, the emphasis of my remark, citing Wilhelm Reich's solution, I would say this: there are many, many ways to strengthen your natural biophilic instincts. The love of animals, not sexual intercourse with animals, but the love of animals is certainly one of them. And there is a 3-tier or 3-yana system in the relation of the human species to other animals, to non-human animals. Love for the domestic animals you call your pets. Love for the animals who may be called subsistent animals, upon which you survive. You rely for survival and for food if you eat animals. And third yana, the wild animals. So the love for those animals and the love for plants and the love for everything that is sensuous and enjoyable in the physical world, the love for the food you eat, the aromas of the food you eat, all of that is a healthy biophilic orientation. All of that belongs, I should say, to a healthy biophilic orientation which can resist biophobia and strengthen your bond to the mother planet. So finally, in the remaining 10 minutes, just want to make some concluding comments about the satanic distortion. The way that Satan has been distorted through the ages came to a critical point in the 17th century. I mentioned that at the beginning of this talk when I referred to Milton's figure of Lucifer. He, above the rest in shape and gesture, proudly eminent, stood like a tower. His form had yet not lost all her original brightness, nor appeared less than archangel ruined. and the excess of glory obscured, as when the sun new risen looks through the horizontal misty air, shorn of his beams. And from behind the moon, in dim eclipse, disastrous twilight sheds on half the nations, and with the fear of change perplexes monarchs. This is a line from the first book of Paradise Lost, a set of lines describing the magnificence and the lofty character of Satan, Lucifer, according to Milton's imagination. I've included at the conclusion of the written material the URL of a PDF. I'm actually reading from that PDF. It's only 8 pages long. It is exemplary of a lot of quite interesting and entertaining material that you find on the internet if you put in the search bar the Satanic hero or the Byronic hero. And this is a compilation of excerpts from Milton and other Romantic writers. Well, touching on that theme, one piece of research that came up regarding Milton, Romantic comments on Milton's Satan. I quote, "It often seems that Romantics love sensationalism for its own sake, especially in the moral domain. And what could be more sensational than arguing that Milton's Satan may be the hero of Paradise Lost? Of course, Milton, at least on the conscious level, did not so intend. After all, he wanted to, quote, justify the ways of God to man, end quote. But subconsciously, what we know of the Milton who detested tyranny argued that the slaying of the wicked king best fulfills the divine mandate, and that Milton who saw himself as personally sanctioned by God may suggest an admiration for the grand being who dared assault the throne of heaven, end quote." So there you have a beautiful example of the implex. Remember, the nature of the implex contains an ambiguity in which the central figure of the implex undergoes changes of value. Sophia is the whore, the outcast, the one who is reviled. Sophia becomes the most revered. She becomes the one who returns humanity to its true self. That is an example of the shifting values of the Sophia-Lucifer implex. So, Milton was a staunch Christian, a Puritan, I believe, but he was against certain religious authorities. And so, you see, he depicted Satan or Lucifer rebelling against God by allusion to his own spirit of rebellion against certain authorities. For instance, he believed that wicked kings, even if they pretended to be Christian kings, ought to be slain, and anyone who did so would be fulfilling God's will. So you can see that the psychology, the religious psychology of the poet Milton was contradictory. And out of that contradiction emerged the first draft or first version of the Satanic hero. The paper that I reference contains some comments on the hero by William Blake, by Shelley, who preferred Prometheus to Satan, by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Anne Radcliffe, who was, by the way, the woman, the English writer who invented the genre of horror and Gothic fiction. She wrote the first novels of horror, which was called Gothic fiction in the language of literary genres. Quotations from Byron, of which I read a couple, and some quotations from Byron's poem, Manfred. So all this stuff was the craze of the Romantic period during the high point of Romanticism, which centered around the year 1820. But then as you move forward toward the end of the 19th century, you come to the phenomena of what I call salon Satanism. And the probably outstanding example of that, there are many, many examples when you delve into that area of European culture. But an easy one is the novel À rebours, usually translated as Against the Grain, by Joris Karl Huysman. And you'll see that I provide a wiki link to that novel. If you want to read a little about it, you can learn something about the tradition of the fin de siècle in Europe, what was trending in those days, you could say. And what was trending was a defiance of religious authority, a disgust and defiance for the Catholic Church, a desire to ridicule and mock Catholicism, to perform the rites of the Catholic Church in an inverted fashion in order to be flagrantly and sensationally heretical. And these are the satanic factors of that period of culture. But as I point out, they do not represent the true moral qualities of the hero as represented in Byron. They represent more of a social sensationalism, as you see today. When you see YouTube clips, usually made by Christians, exposing Satanism in Hollywood and in the movie business, they would point out, for instance, that various singers and entertainers exhibit the inverted pentacle, or some music video clip shows the singer wearing an elaborate hat that imitates the face of Baphomet. And all of that proves that the performers and agents in the Hollywood entertainment industry are Satanists, right? No, it doesn't prove anything of the sort. They may be genuinely sick and nefarious people, and I'm sure they are, but they do not worship an entity called Satan. They simply exploit the sensationalism of the satanic for their own purposes. And one of the reasons that singers do it is to keep their image, to make their image interesting. You know, it inflames the imagination of mystery-seeking teenagers who lack the discrimination and discernment to see how they're being conned and manipulated. So it's kitsch, it's sensationalism. The same thing for Rothschilds and members of the European nobility meeting at some castle somewhere and dressing up in Dionysian masks, you know, the scene of the Dionysian orgy in Eyes Wide Shut. This doesn't prove that these people are Satanists. They may be, in the delusions of their own minds, Satanists. But they are not actually Satanists, because Satan doesn't exist. That is the greatest trick of Satan, to convince you that it does exist, when in fact there is no such entity. There is no central figure of cosmic evil operating against humanity. But there are very, very sick people, biophobic people, decadent and depraved human animals who are working against humanity and working against the sanity and well-being of the species. You might find it entertaining, you know, to research a little bit. There are some short essays on the internet about the Byronic hero. They're the kind of essays that you would read if you were taking a college course on the Romantic movement that covered the art, the poetry, and the literature of Europe through the 19th and into the early 20th century. All in all, however, it's pretty difficult to track what happens to the figure of the Byronic / Satanic hero after, say, World War I. The one outstanding example that I could offer you in that area comes out of Russia, and it comes out of the Stalinist era through the work of one outstanding Russian novelist who stands in a class by himself. That would be Mikhail Bulgakov, Bulgakov. Bulgakov. And Bulgakov was the author of one of the really, I would say, 10 greatest novels of the 20th century, and that is The Master and Margarita. And in The Master and Margarita, there are a number of diabolic, demonic, satanic figures. The central one being the black magician Voland, W-O-L-A-N-D, with the double V, interestingly, in his name, and in his calling card, the symbol of the double V, pronounced Voland or Voland. And in the opening scene of The Master and Margarita, when he appears in a park in London, Voland announces himself as a practitioner of Cherny Magi. Cherny is the Russian word for black, and Magi means magic. So he comes right out and tells you who he is. And then the story proceeds. It's a beautiful romance between a Russian writer, the master, and a woman who adores him, Margarita. And in this story, uniquely, the role of Satan assumes, I would say, its triumphant representation. Without question. The triumphant and incomparable representation of Satan as a hero and as a benevolent ally occurs in the figure of Voland in The Master and Margarita. Now, you could go read that novel if you still read novels. It's quite a kick. But if you would like to see the 7-hour production done by the Russian State Film Company, you can find it on YouTube. And it's quite well done, actually, and very, very faithful to the book. In fact, it's 7.5 hours long because it practically repeats every line of dialogue in the book verbatim. So there you see Voland come to town with his troupe of mischief makers, including the black cat Behemoth, a beautiful witch named Hilda, and a couple of other assistants to the master. And so it turns out, in this wonderful satanic novel by Bulgakov, that Voland is actually the ally and friend and benefactor of the romantic couple who are central to the novel. He is not, however, the benefactor of humanity at large. No. Bulgakov makes it very clear that his satanic hero only favors lovers and artists and looks upon the normal run of the human race with complete contempt. In fact, Voland and his troupe entertain themselves by confusing and terrifying the local population. But they give special care and attention to the Master and Margarita. So that novel is truly a treasure of world literature. and truly outstanding. Now, I haven't done any studies of literature, comparative European literature, and I haven't delved into the art and culture and poetry and painting of the modern and postmodernist movements in quite a long time. I do have the research material for such a study in my library, but the library is packed away. So there may be other examples, let's just say, in the realm of the novel, where figures of the satanic appear. You could say, for instance, that in Beelzebub's Tales for His Children, Gurdjieff has presented a comic and benevolent portrait of a satanic hero akin to Mephistopheles, akin to Beelzebub. And I've read Beelzebub's Tales to His Children a couple of times, actually, but it doesn't really carry the romantic and lyric power of Bulgakov's wonderful novel. So I leave you, finally, after an hour and a half of chattering away, with that allusion. And I highly recommend that if you can still read and you enjoy novels, you spend a few days with the Master and Margarita, or watch the Russian Film Company production on YouTube. I believe the channel is Fatboy Tokyo. It's in Russian with English subtitles. There is a scene in it where Margarita receives the witch's traditional potion from Voland. He sends his emissary to her. The emissary gives her a jar with the witch's ointment in it. And when she rubs the witch's ointment on herself, she's able to fly. So there are some special effects in the film. They're kind of hokey compared to slick Hollywood special effects, but they're pretty good. I must say I particularly enjoy the one scene in which you see Margarita's maid, who also gets her hands on the potion, flying over the roofs of Moscow naked on a pig. There's something about seeing a naked woman flying on a pig that really lifts a man's heart. And that is a scene, one of the wonderful scenes. Also, the scene that follows, where Margarita joins the late night or midnight festival of fairies and elves and nymphs and satyrs in the woods outside Moscow. Wow, that is quite a scene. And the depiction of Pan in that scene is absolutely brilliant and true and genuine and truly in itself stands as an argument against the representations of Pan as an evil and sinister creature. So you could say that Christianity turned Pan into the devil, but Mikhail Bulgakov turned the devil back into Pan. So on that happy note, I conclude this oral commentary. There remain 3 more talks to go along with the texts in the 10-pack foundation of Mythophrenia. Coming soon.